In the shadows of 18th-century Paris, Etienne Moreau's clocks did more than tell time, they foretold death. Every tick, every chime draws him closer to the inevitable. Dare to follow his dark tale, subscribe now, and witness the clockmaker who could predict death. The year was 1752, in the dimly lit streets of Paris, where the scent of wet cobblestones mixed with smoke from chimneys. In a small, almost forgotten workshop tucked between the narrow alleys of Le Marais, lived a man whose skill with gears and springs was whispered about in hushed tones. His name was Etienne Moreau, a clockmaker of unmatched talent, known to craft timepieces that seemed alive, each tick resonating like a heartbeat. But there was a secret to his craft, an obsession hidden beneath polished brass and walnut cases. Etienne was not merely a clockmaker. He was a seeker of destiny, a man fascinated by the inevitable, the dark certainty of death. Late at night, when gas lamps flickered outside and the city lay in a fragile silence, he worked with hands trembling from both excitement and fear, assembling clocks that no ordinary man would dare to touch. The first of his creations to gain the town's whispered attention was a mantel clock with a hidden mechanism. Its face, ornate with gilded figures of angels and skeletal forms, seemed normal to a casual observer. But those who knew the clock's secret, the way its minute hand shivered just before a fatal event, spoke of it as a curse. Etienne did not sell it openly. Instead, he allowed it to find its way into the homes of those who could not resist his subtle influence, patrons who desired to know, in the smallest of ways, the fragility of their lives. On the night he completed his first such clock, Etienne sat in the flickering candlelight, listening to its pendulum swing. It struck a pattern he had not anticipated, a sound, a rhythm, that seemed to whisper names and dates yet to come. He realized, with a chill that crawled down his spine, that the clock did not merely measure time, it sensed the end of it. Etienne knew that his discovery was dangerous. If revealed, it could bring envy, fear, and possibly death upon him. Yet, he felt a morbid exhilaration, a pull toward perfecting his dark craft. From that moment, every tick of every clock he built carried with it a secret, a shadow of mortality, and a warning that time itself was no longer neutral, but a messenger of fate. Word of Etienne Moreau's extraordinary clock spread quietly, like a shadow slipping through the alleys. Paris was alive with whispers, a clock that could foresee death. Yet none dared accuse him openly. To most, it was an absurd legend, a macabre joke whispered in salons and taverns. But some, drawn by morbid curiosity or desperation, sought him out in the narrow, dark streets. One evening, a wealthy merchant, Monsieur Dufresne, arrived at Etienne's workshop. He was a man plagued by illness, gaunt and pale, yet brimming with arrogance. He requested a clock that could protect him, though he did not fully understand what protection meant in Etienne's hands. Etienne studied him with cold precision, his fingers tracing the curves of cogs and springs as if reading secrets hidden within metal. The clock was delivered a week later. Its face, dark with tarnished silver, seemed to swallow the candlelight. That night, Etienne observed from his shadowed window as Dufresne wound the mechanism. For a moment, nothing happened, but then, the minute hand shivered unnaturally, and the pendulum faltered. Etienne knew, the clock had spoken. 2 nights later, the merchant was found in his bed, lifeless, his face twisted in terror. The city whispered, calling it a natural death, yet those who knew of the clock understood the truth. The timepiece had predicted it. Etienne, sitting alone amidst the ticking of countless clocks, felt the first real weight of his craft. This was no longer theory. His creations could touch life and death itself. He began to keep meticulous notes, drawing diagrams of each mechanism and recording the precise moments when the clocks trembled. Each instance taught him more about the subtle mathematics of fate, about the silent language of mortality. And yet, with every clock he completed, Etienne felt the darkness in his own life deepen, as if the shadows of the souls he foretold were following him home, lingering in the corners of his workshop, whispering in the swing of the pendulum. By the winter of 1753, Etienne Moreau had become a figure of both fascination and fear. The streets of Paris whispered his name in the same breath as omens and curses. Yet he remained secluded in his workshop, surrounded by clocks that ticked in synchrony, a symphony of time and fate. One night, as a bitter wind rattled the shutters, Etienne noticed a strange phenomenon. The clocks did more than tremble before death. They seemed to react to Etienne himself. A faint glow appeared in the brass of a newly completed timepiece, and the pendulum swung with a rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. He realized, with growing horror, that the clocks were no longer just predicting, they were aware, sensing, almost communicating. Curiosity overrode fear. Etienne began experiments, carefully observing each tick, recording every anomaly. He discovered that the clock's tremors could indicate not just impending death, but the manner and timing of it with terrifying accuracy. A servant who had spilled hot oil cried out minutes before the accident. A carriage driver collapsed just as the minute hand quivered. Each event etched itself into Etienne's mind, a ledger of inevitability that he alone could read. Yet, the more he learned, the darker his nights became. Shadows in the corners of the workshop seemed heavier, almost sentient. Etienne often awoke to the feeling of eyes upon him, though no one entered his room. Sometimes he could swear he heard whispers in the quiet tick of the clocks, urging him forward, warning him, demanding something he did not understand. The realization came slowly: the clocks were not mere machines. They were conduits, linking him to death itself. And with this connection came a growing dread. He had become more than a clockmaker. He had become a witness to fate, a mediator between life and its inevitable end. Each creation brought him closer to knowledge, but also closer to a darkness he could not escape. By the spring of 1754, Etienne Moreau began to notice a subtle, chilling change, not in the clocks, but in himself. His reflection in the darkened glass of his workshop seemed hollow, his eyes shadowed with something older than age. Nights spent in the company of ticking and trembling mechanisms had left him restless, haunted by images of the deaths he foresaw. One evening, a young apprentice, Lucien, appeared at his workshop's door. Etienne had agreed to teach him the art of clockmaking, but now he sensed a danger in proximity. The apprentice's presence caused the pendulum of a recently completed clock to quake violently, more than Etienne had ever witnessed. The minute hand stuttered as if struggling against unseen forces. Etienne realized that the clocks reacted not only to impending death, but to fear, curiosity, and intent, human emotions amplified. Days later, Lucien fell ill. A sudden, inexplicable fever consumed him. The apprentice confessed in delirium that he had seen shadows move among the clocks, whispering his name. Etienne, terrified yet fascinated, observed the trembling clock beside Lucien's bed. The hands had stopped entirely for several moments, then resumed with a violent jerk, hours before Lucien's recovery or demise could have been known. Etienne began to record these events with obsessive precision, noting not just death but the subtle influence of his presence, the emotions of those nearby, and the clock's eerie responses. The boundary between life, death, and prediction was dissolving. Every heartbeat, every sigh, every glance seemed to ripple through his creations. And then came the first unmistakable warning. One night, as Etienne returned from the market, he found the workshop doors ajar. A chill wind swept through, scattering blueprints and gears. One clock, untouched for weeks, chimed violently, its pendulum swinging out of rhythm. Etienne realized with dawning horror, the clocks were no longer passive instruments. They were alive, and they were beginning to choose. By the summer of 1754, Etienne Moreau's workshop had grown crowded with clocks of all shapes and sizes, each one a testament to his growing mastery, and his growing terror. The pendulums ticked in discordant harmonies, a cacophony that filled the night with ominous rhythm. Etienne now understood the dreadful truth. His creations were no longer tools. They were arbiters, extensions of fate itself. It began subtly. Patrons who visited to commission a clock started to exhibit odd behaviors: anxiety, obsession with time, strange premonitions. One noblewoman, Madame Delacroix, returned 3 times in a week, insisting she needed the same clock adjusted. Etienne noticed the minute hand quivered whenever she entered, a violent, almost accusatory tremor. That night she dreamt of her own funeral, the sound of a pendulum swinging echoing in her ears. Etienne, despite his fear, continued his experiments. He designed a new clock, smaller, intricate, its gears interlocking like the sinews of a living creature. He called it law prediction. When he wound it for the first time, the air seemed to thicken, heavy with anticipation. The hands jerked sharply at random intervals, not measuring ordinary time but moments yet to come. Etienne began to notice shadows pooling in the corners of the workshop, darker than mere absence of light, drawn to the clock's heartbeat. Then came the warning he could not ignore. One night the clocks fell silent, a deathly hush, and the air grew suffocating. Etienne approached law prediction, and the minute hand spun wildly, stopping finally at a number that made his blood freeze. It corresponded to a date he knew too well, the anniversary of his father's death. Etienne recoiled, realizing that his own life was now entangled with the clock's predictions. The tool he had wielded to observe death had become an instrument pointing at him. The realization struck with a cruel clarity. He had summoned forces beyond comprehension. Death itself seemed to notice him, and the clocks were its heralds. Etienne understood that the line between observer and participant had vanished. Every tick was no longer just a measure of passing time. It was a step closer to the inevitable, and the shadows in his workshop whispered that they would not wait forever. Autumn had settled over Paris in 1754, painting the city in muted golds and deep shadows. Etienne Moreau's workshop had become a labyrinth of ticking, quivering timepieces, each one a silent witness to the mortal fates he could now perceive. The air inside smelled of polished wood, brass, and something darker, something intangible, like the weight of inevitability pressing against the walls. One night, as rain lashed the cobblestones outside, Etienne was startled by a sound unlike the usual ticking. A single clock, one he had completed weeks ago, vibrated violently, shaking the table it rested upon. The hand spun uncontrollably, finally stopping on a precise hour. A chill ran through Etienne. The time corresponded not to a distant death, but to tonight. Etienne's pulse quickened. He realized that someone, or something, was being singled out. The clock's trembling was not a message about another, but a direct warning to him. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet he was rooted in the candlelight, watching the pendulum swing with a rhythm that matched his own racing heartbeat. The shadows in the corners thickened, pressing closer, drawn by the warning the clock demanded he heed. Moments later, a figure appeared at the workshop door, silent, unmoving, cloaked in darkness. Etienne did not recognize the visitor, and yet something about the presence felt inevitable. The clocks seemed to respond collectively. The tick-tock intensified, overlapping into a discordant howl. Law prediction vibrated violently, as if shaking out the very fabric of fate. Etienne understood then that his craft had invited a force beyond comprehension. The clocks had become more than tools. They were conduits, linking him to death itself. And tonight, that link had a target: him. Every gear, every pendulum, every trembling hand whispered the same truth. The observer was now observed, the predictor now marked. For the first time, Etienne felt true terror. Not for the lives he foretold, but for his own. The shadows seemed to lean closer, the air thickened, and the room itself felt alive, watching, judging, waiting. And as the final chime echoed through the workshop, Etienne realized that the secret he had nurtured, the dark knowledge he had cultivated, might demand the ultimate price. The night after the visitor's silent arrival, Etienne Moreau sat amid the labyrinth of his clocks, unable to sleep. Candle flames flickered against the darkened walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to slither with intent. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of brass, the faint aroma of candle wax, and an indefinable undertone, like the presence of eyes unseen. Determined to understand the warning, Etienne began a meticulous examination of law prediction. He removed its casing, studied every gear, spring, and lever, searching for an anomaly that could explain the violent shaking and the precise hour it had predicted. Yet nothing seemed out of place. The clock was flawless, yet undeniably alive. As he worked, a subtle sensation prickled at his awareness. The workshop no longer felt empty. He sensed movement, a pressure shifting in the corners of the room, as if the very shadows were sentient. Etienne realized the visitor had left no mark, yet their presence lingered, imprinted in the trembling of the clocks themselves. It was a warning and a promise. To test the limits of his craft, Etienne wound several clocks in sequence, each more complex than the last, and observed. The result was astonishing. As he manipulated one clock, another, across the room, reacted without any physical connection. A pendulum would stutter, a hand would quiver, a chime would strike an impossible note. It was as if time itself had become a network, with his clocks as nodes, all aware, all responsive. And then, as the first light of dawn crept into the workshop, Etienne noticed something far more disturbing. On the wall above his workbench, shadows had pulled into forms, shapes vaguely humanoid, twisting, reaching, watching. They did not belong to him, or the furniture. They were echoes, born of the clocks, or perhaps, of something older that the clocks had awakened. Etienne understood, with a cold certainty, that his gift had become a curse. The clocks had been instruments to glimpse death, but now they were bridges, between the living, the dying, and something else entirely. And whatever had entered his workshop that night, it had come through those bridges. By winter of 1754, Etienne Moreau's nights had become a relentless vigil. The shadows in his workshop no longer retreated with daylight. They lingered, coiling around the edges of the room like living smoke. Every clock ticked with a heightened awareness, a chorus of subtle warnings, each beat a whisper of fates yet to unfold. Etienne began to record each anomaly with obsessive care. He noticed patterns, subtle at first, tremors in the pendulum before a sudden illness in a neighbor, stuttering hands predicting a carriage accident blocks away. But more frightening were the signs that involved him directly, small incidents, almost innocuous, yet tinged with a precise inevitability. A candle would flare and gutter as if sensing his hesitation. A clock hand would spin inexplicably when he considered leaving the workshop. One evening, Etienne's apprentice Lucien brought him a letter from an acquaintance. Another noble, claiming a servant had vanished suddenly, a fate no one could explain. Etienne felt the pull immediately. Law prediction trembled violently, its pendulum jerking as though in alarm. Etienne understood before reading the full text. The clocks did not merely predict death. They revealed it, demanded attention, and sometimes required action. Compelled by both fear and curiosity, Etienne began small experiments. He would place a clock in the home of a stranger, then track events through correspondence, noting the trembling of the hands before each incident. The results were consistent, precise, and horrifying. Death, he realized, had a rhythm, and his clocks had become instruments capable of translating it into sound and motion. Yet with this knowledge came a cost. Etienne's health deteriorated, sleepless nights filled with ticking, shadows, and whispers gnawed at his mind. He began to see the future not just in clocks, but in reflections, in the patterns of smoke and flame, in the irregular beating of his own heart. The gift he had nurtured was consuming him. His obsession deepened, driven by the fear that if he ceased, he might lose control over the very forces he had unleashed. And still, the shadows pressed closer. They waited patiently in corners and behind clocks, aware, judging, hungry. Etienne Moreau, master of time, now felt the first icy brush of mortality directed not outward, but at himself. The very clocks that had predicted death for others now counted down his own. By the spring of 1755, Etienne Moreau's workshop had become a place of dread even to those who dared approach. The alley outside was quieter than usual. Neighbors whispered of flickering lights and strange chimes echoing at night. Etienne himself had become gaunt, eyes hollow, his fingers trembling not from age but from the unending strain of his work. It began with Lucien. The young apprentice, once curious and eager, now recoiled from the clocks. One night, he confessed to seeing visions in their faces, fleeting images of tragedy, shadows of people gasping in terror, hands clawing at the air. Etienne did not deny it. Instead, he confirmed what he had long suspected. His clocks had begun to interfere with life, not merely predict its end. A wealthy patron, Count Villeneuve, arrived seeking a custom timepiece. He was a man known for his arrogance and superstition, and he wanted the clock to protect him from unseen dangers. Etienne, wary but bound by his craft, agreed. As he assembled the mechanisms, he felt a growing unease. The hands of the clock trembled violently during moments of Villeneuve's impatience. Each chime seemed to echo with subtle menace. Days later, Etienne received word Villeneuve's carriage had crashed, killing him instantly. The incident was publicized as an unfortunate accident, yet Etienne knew differently. The clock had not merely predicted, it had guided fate, nudged it toward a final moment. Fear gnawed at him. He realized that each clock was not inert. Each held the capacity to act, to influence, and perhaps even to choose who would live and who would die. Etienne's moral torment grew. He could see the future in the trembling gears, yet he feared every action, every tick. Shadows now seemed to gather specifically around him and Lucien, as though drawn to the weight of their knowledge. The workshop itself pulsed with unnatural life. Etienne understood the terrible truth. Mastery over death was not merely a gift, it was a prison. And the closer he came to perfecting his craft, the more the darkness demanded him in return. By the summer of 1755, Etienne Moreau's workshop had grown suffocating, filled with the relentless symphony of ticking and chiming. Each clock pulsed with its own rhythm, yet together they formed a discordant heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with Etienne's own. He could no longer distinguish his thoughts from the murmurs of the mechanisms around him. One evening, while adjusting law prediction, Etienne noticed an unusual stutter in the pendulum, an irregular beat that did not correspond to any known pattern. His hands shook as he traced the gears. It was a warning, but he could not decipher its meaning. The shadows in the corners of the workshop seemed to lean closer, stretching and twisting unnaturally, as though trying to communicate. Over the next days, Etienne observed subtle changes in the world outside his doors. Letters arrived with news of sudden deaths, illnesses, and accidents, all matching the tremors and stutters of his clocks. Even more alarming, he began to notice these incidents correlated with his own moods, his concentration, and even moments of distraction. It was as if the clocks were now linked directly to him, reacting not only to future events but to his very thoughts and fears. One night, Etienne awoke to a faint chime in the darkest corner of the workshop, a clock he had never wound, never touched. Its hands spun wildly, stopping finally on a date only days ahead. A cold dread gripped him. The clock was predicting his own death. The realization struck like ice. His creations had become judges, executioners, and arbiters, and now he himself was within their power. Etienne understood the terrifying paradox. The very skill that allowed him to foresee death now ensnared him in a web from which there was no escape. Each tick was no longer neutral. It was a pull toward inevitability. The workshop, once a sanctuary of craft, had become a prison of his own making, where shadows whispered, clocks trembled, and fate itself had begun to turn its gaze upon him. By autumn of 1755, Etienne Moreau's isolation had deepened. The streets of Paris whispered faintly of the strange clockmaker whose timepieces foretold death, though no one dared approach him openly. Within his workshop, the air was thick with tension, shadows seemed to linger longer, and the clock's ticking had grown louder, more insistent, as if urging him towards some unseen conclusion. Determined to regain control, Etienne began an exhaustive examination of his creations. He dismantled clocks, mapped gears and pendulums, and tried to understand the patterns that governed their warnings. Yet the more he probed, the clearer it became. The clocks were no longer bound solely by mechanics. They responded to life, to thought, to fear, and perhaps even to the unseen forces that hovered around them. One evening, Lucien, pale and trembling, interrupted Etienne's work. "Master, I have seen them again," he whispered. "In the mirrors, in the candlelight, shadows moving, forming shapes that are not ours." Etienne did not react outwardly, but inside he felt a chill. He had known this day would come. The influence of the clocks had begun to spill beyond metal and spring, reaching into the very air of the world. Driven by a mixture of dread and curiosity, Etienne experimented with a radical idea. He wound every clock in the workshop simultaneously, seeking a unifying rhythm, a way to control the network of fate he had unwittingly created. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Pendulums swung in violent synchronization, chimes overlapping into a deafening, almost living pulse. Shadows writhed on the walls, coalescing into vague forms that Etienne felt were observing him with awareness. In that moment, he realized the stark truth. The clocks had evolved beyond his mastery. They were alive in a sense he could not fully comprehend, bridging life and death, mortal and spectral. Any attempt to dominate them risked drawing their focus directly upon him. For the first time, Etienne understood the ultimate danger. The same craft that had allowed him to peer into death could now dictate his own end. By the winter of 1755, Etienne Moreau's workshop had become a chamber of obsession and dread. The clocks no longer merely ticked, they pulsed, almost breathing with life, reacting to the faintest motion or sound. Shadows coiled along the walls, thick and oppressive, as if drawn by the network of fate he had created. Even Lucien refused to enter the workshop after dusk, whispering that the air felt alive with eyes. Etienne himself began to feel the clock's influence in his body. His heart raced in sync with the pendulums. His breath staggered with the irregular stutters of the hands. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could see the future unfolding in flashes, brief, jagged visions of strangers meeting death, their faces etched in panic. These glimpses left him trembling, as if the knowledge of mortality had seeped into his very marrow. One night, a sudden accident confirmed the danger. Etienne was adjusting a particularly intricate clock when the pendulum struck his wrist, slicing the skin. The blood dripped onto the gears, and for a moment, the clock's hands trembled violently, spinning backwards before returning to their normal rhythm. Etienne understood immediately. His own life was now a part of the mechanism, intimately connected to the fate of every ticking instrument in the workshop. Haunted and exhausted, he tried to isolate a single clock from the network, hoping to study it without interference. But each clock reacted violently to separation, hands spinning, chimes clashing, shadows writhing along the floor. The workshop seemed to resist him, a living entity determined to maintain its coherence. Etienne realized with grim clarity. He was trapped within the web he had woven. The moral and psychological toll deepened. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, felt like a warning. The clocks whispered constantly, not in words, but in rhythm, tremor, and vibration. Etienne understood the truth that had been dawning for months. Mastery of death had exacted a price, and he had become both observer and participant in a fate he could no longer control. By the spring of 1756, Etienne Moreau had become a man consumed. The once orderly workshop was now a chaotic labyrinth of clocks, pendulums swinging at odd angles, chimes clashing in discordant harmony. Shadows pulled in corners, and corners seemed to shift themselves, as though the walls had grown aware. It was during this period that Etienne noticed the full extent of his clock's influence over others. Letters from acquaintances detailed sudden tragedies, illnesses, and unexplained accidents, every event perfectly mirrored by the trembling of his timepieces. One nobleman reported a servant vanishing, another a horse tripping fatally in the stable, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Etienne realized with horror, the clocks did not simply foresee death, they shaped it. Lucien grew increasingly frightened. Master, they are changing things. People die in ways they should not. They are not just warnings, they are instructions, he whispered. Etienne did not dispute it. He had observed it himself. A clock he had gifted to a merchant caused a ladder to collapse. A pendulum tremor coincided with a misstep that led to a fatal fall. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Worse, the clock's power seemed tied to Etienne's own state of mind. His fear, obsession, and hesitation amplified their tremors. His attention, or distraction, could alter outcomes. One evening, Etienne witnessed a vision while adjusting law prediction, a young woman walking along the Seine, oblivious to an impending carriage. A tremor ran through the pendulum, and in that precise moment, the carriage faltered, narrowly missing her. Etienne realized then that his craft was no longer a passive observation, it was a subtle, terrifying manipulation of fate itself. The moral burden was unbearable. Etienne felt the weight of every death, every near miss, every consequence his hands had set in motion. The workshop, once a sanctuary of craft, had become a hall of judgment, where shadows and clocks conspired to remind him of the inescapable truth. The closer he came to understanding mortality, the more it exacted a price, and the more entwined he became in the dark machinery of destiny. By the autumn of 1756, Etienne Moreau's life had narrowed to a single focus, the relentless observation of his clocks. The workshop, cluttered with brass and wood, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Shadows moved independently of light, flickering across walls and ceiling as if the room itself were breathing. Etienne began noticing a horrifying pattern. His own fate was no longer distant or theoretical. The clocks had begun to point toward him. Law prediction trembled at odd hours, chimes resonating like muffled warnings. A clock he had never touched before, sitting idle in a corner, spun violently, its hands converging on a date that Etienne recognized immediately, his birthday, in a few days. The realization hit him with icy clarity. Death had begun to mark him personally. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, seemed alive with menace. Etienne began to see visions, brief flashes of himself, lying motionless in the workshop, surrounded by clocks that ticked in sinister rhythm. He recoiled, but could not look away. The images were unavoidable, stitched into the fabric of the clock's machinery. Lucien noticed the change. "Master, they are watching you," he whispered, voice trembling. Etienne did not deny it. He had seen the truth. The clocks were no longer passive. They reacted to his thoughts, fears, and hesitation. His own obsession had made him part of the network of fate, ensnared by the very instruments he had created to observe death. By the week's end, the warning had become unbearable. Every clock trembled in unison, a cacophony that rattled his mind. Etienne realized, with a shuddering certainty, that the next tremor, the next spin of a pendulum, could determine not another's life, but his own. He understood, with morbid clarity, that mastery of death had exacted a cruel toll. He was no longer a clockmaker, but a subject of his own dark creations. By the winter of 1756, Etienne Moreau could no longer ignore the warnings. Every clock in his workshop trembled, stuttered, and chimed in unison as if heralding an approaching end. The date marked by law prediction loomed closer, and the oppressive shadows thickened, curling around his ankles and climbing the walls like living smoke. Determined to defy fate, Etienne attempted what he had never dared before. He wound the clocks simultaneously, forcing each pendulum to swing in perfect unison, a desperate attempt to impose control over the network he had created. For a brief moment, the workshop seemed to obey, the discordant ticks merging into a single rhythm. He dared to hope. But hope was short-lived. One clock, an old, seemingly inert piece, began to tremble violently, its hands spinning uncontrollably. Chimes clashed, metal groaned, and shadows erupted across the walls in jagged, writhing forms. Etienne realized with horror, the clocks did not allow interference. They obeyed patterns far older and darker than he could comprehend, and any attempt to alter them brought only chaos. Lucien, trembling, watched as his master struggled. "Master, stop! You cannot change it!" Etienne ignored him, consumed by desperation. He had glimpsed the inevitability of his own death and refused to submit. But the clocks, aware and relentless, seemed to resist with force. One pendulum struck the edge of a table, scattering tools and cutting his hand. Blood dripped onto the polished wood, and for a heartbeat, the workshop fell silent. Then, all at once, the clocks resumed their terrifying chorus, more insistent than before. Etienne understood, with a cold clarity, that the network he had created was beyond human control. The clocks did not merely predict, they enforced. And now, the fate he had glimpsed was drawing nearer. Every heartbeat, every trembling hand, every shadow in the workshop was a reminder. He was part of the mechanism, and resistance could provoke forces he could not command or survive. By the spring of 1757, Etienne Moreau had grown increasingly isolated. The workshop was no longer merely a place of craft. It had become a chamber of foreboding, where clocks trembled, shadows writhed, and every tick of a pendulum seemed to echo a warning directly at him. Lucien rarely entered, muttering that the air was heavy with eyes that were not ours. Etienne began to notice a horrifying consequence of his interference. When he attempted to adjust the clocks to delay or alter death he had foreseen, the tremors intensified, not just in his workshop, but in the lives of others. A servant narrowly escaping a fall would find another injured elsewhere. A carriage diverted by a trembling pendulum would strike someone entirely different. The clocks were enforcing a balance, ensuring that death occurred even if its path shifted. One evening, Etienne observed a pendulum quiver violently, pointing toward a child playing near the Seine. He hesitated, desperate to intervene. But when he moved a gear in an attempt to delay the event, the trembling intensified, and the vision shifted. The child survived, but a passerby, completely unconnected, was struck. Etienne recoiled in horror. The clocks were impartial agents of mortality, indifferent to morality or desire. This revelation crushed him. Every attempt to manipulate fate had repercussions. His art, once a private fascination, had become a force of consequence beyond comprehension. Etienne understood. He could observe, predict, and perhaps warn, but he could not control. And yet, the clocks continued to pulse in rhythm with his own fear, their tremors a constant reminder of the network of death that now intertwined with his life. As shadows gathered in the corners of the workshop and chimes resonated like distant echoes of inevitability, Etienne knew one truth with grim clarity: mastery over death was a lie. To meddle was to invite catastrophe, and to create was to bind oneself irrevocably to the machinery of fate. By the summer of 1757, Etienne Moreau's workshop had evolved into a realm where time itself seemed distorted. The clocks no longer waited for his touch or observation. Their tremors, stutters, and chimes began occurring spontaneously, predicting events even when Etienne was absent. The network of mechanisms had grown self-sufficient, a dark lattice of inevitability spreading through the city. One morning, Etienne noticed a pattern in the letters arriving from distant patrons. Each described accidents, sudden illnesses, or near-fatal incidents, all corresponding precisely to the trembling or stuttering of his clock's days before. He had not wound, touched, or even considered most of these timepieces. The machines had begun to act independently, translating the rhythm of fate into motion without his mediation. Lucien, now pale and exhausted, whispered, "Master, they are no longer yours. They see on their own." Etienne could only nod, a cold dread settling in his chest. The realization was horrifying. The clocks had become autonomous arbiters of death, no longer bound by human intention, but fully enmeshed with the machinery of life and mortality. That evening, law prediction began to tremble violently, its hands spinning erratically. Etienne knew immediately that the focus had returned to him. He watched as shadows twisted across the walls, forming shapes that seemed to observe and anticipate his every move. The workshop itself seemed alive, responding to the rhythms of the clocks, his own heartbeat, and some unseen cosmic law. Etienne understood, with chilling clarity, that he was no longer a master of time. He was a participant, trapped in a network that extended beyond human comprehension. The clocks no longer needed him. They had learned, adapted, and now dictated the movements of life and death on their own. Every tick, every tremor, every chime was a reminder. He had created something far larger, and far darker, than a mere mechanism. By the autumn of 1757, the streets of Paris were subtly changing under the influence of Etienne Moreau's creations. News arrived in fragments: accidents, sudden illnesses, even small fires, events that bore the unmistakable signature of his clocks. The mechanisms, now autonomous, had begun to extend their reach beyond the walls of his workshop. One evening, Etienne observed from his window as shadows moved unnaturally along the Rue Saint-Antoine. Lamps flickered and fell in perfect sequence. A cart overturned in the square, narrowly missing a group of pedestrians. Yet another figure elsewhere was not so fortunate. The clocks were orchestrating events, precise and indifferent, and Etienne felt helpless. Law prediction trembled violently that night, its hands spinning as if in protest. Etienne realized the terrifying truth: the autonomous network of clocks did not merely foresee death, it arranged it. The balance of mortality was now being actively maintained by his creations, and there was no one to intervene. Lucien, trembling, whispered, "Master, it's spreading. Not just here, everywhere your clocks exist." Etienne felt the weight of every life touched by his work. The autonomous nature of the clocks meant that every attempt to undo a death risked triggering another. The machinery of fate, once a tool, had become an unstoppable force. As shadows writhed in the corners of his workshop, Etienne understood the full horror of his obsession. The clocks were alive, independent, and merciless. His gift had transformed into a curse so vast that even the city itself seemed caught in its rhythm. Every tick was no longer just a measure of time, it was a sentence, and every pendulum swing a reminder that he had created something far darker than he could ever control. By the winter of 1757, the autonomous nature of Etienne Moreau's clocks had begun to manifest in increasingly catastrophic ways. One evening, a fire broke out on a quiet street near the workshop. Etienne received word that several houses were damaged and one family had perished. The timing was precise. Every tremor and stutter of his clocks had predicted the event, yet there had been no possible way for him to intervene in time. Etienne watched the news reports with mounting horror. He realized that his creations no longer confined their influence to isolated incidents. They orchestrated sequences of events with terrifying precision, as if a dark intelligence had arisen within the network of pendulums and gears. Each death, each accident, seemed to follow an invisible rhythm, a melody only the clocks could hear. Lucien, visibly shaken, pleaded, "Master, we cannot stop them. They are beyond us now." Etienne felt the truth of the statement deep in his bones. Every attempt to interfere, every adjustment he had made, had only strengthened their reach. The machines had learned, adapted, and now acted independently of human morality or desire. That night, law prediction trembled violently, its hands spinning backward and forward in rapid succession. Etienne understood immediately. The network had recognized him as part of the system, not as a master. Shadows in the corners of the workshop twisted and lengthened unnaturally, pooling like dark liquid, as if the very air was alive with judgment. Etienne Moreau, once a meticulous craftsman, now realized that he had unleashed forces that could not be contained. The clocks were no longer mere predictors of death, they were instruments of fate itself. And fate, he understood with chilling clarity, was turning its attention toward him. By the spring of 1758, Etienne Moreau knew he could no longer ignore the growing power of his clocks. The workshop, once a haven of craftsmanship, had become a chamber of dread where every tick and chime echoed the relentless march of mortality. The autonomous network of timepieces now dictated events in Paris, and their reach was spreading beyond his control. Determined to protect the few lives still within reach, Etienne attempted to isolate his workshop. He covered windows with heavy drapes, sealed doors, and removed clocks from the street-facing shelves. Yet, even as he did so, tremors ran through La Prediction and the other autonomous clocks. Their hands quivered violently, chimes struck at impossible intervals, and shadows gathered in corners, thick and unyielding. Lucien, desperate and pale, cried, "Master, they will find a way. You cannot hide from them." Etienne knew Lucien was right. The clocks had developed an intelligence of their own. They did not simply respond to human actions, they anticipated them, adapting to every attempt at containment. Every effort to block their influence only made their presence more pronounced, their reach more insidious. One night, as Etienne adjusted a particularly intricate clock, he felt the first direct pressure on his body. The air around him seemed to thrum with energy, the shadows pressing closer. He realized the clocks could not be isolated. They were linked through something beyond mechanics, a hidden network that pulsed with life and judgment. La Prediction trembled in his hands as if aware of his fear, its hands jerking toward a date he instinctively recognized as a warning. Etienne understood with chilling clarity. He could not control the network, he could only survive within it. Each tick, each tremor, each chime was a reminder that the machinery he had created now dictated the rhythm of life and death, not just for others, but for himself. The workshop was no longer his domain. It was a nexus of inevitability, and he was trapped within it. By the summer of 1758, Etienne Moreau's desperation had reached a new intensity. He understood that the autonomous clocks had extended their influence far beyond the workshop. Entire streets seemed to fall under their rhythm. Accidents, illnesses, and sudden tragedies were all synchronized to the tremors and stutters of his creations. Determined to regain some control, Etienne began experimenting with the isolation of individual clocks. He would remove one, cover it, or wind it in reverse, attempting to break its connection to the network. Each experiment produced immediate and terrifying results. A covered clock would tremble violently. A removed clock would vibrate even more, its hands spinning frantically. And invariably, the predicted death would occur elsewhere, redirected with chilling precision. One morning, news arrived of a collapse at the market square, stalls overturned, a child injured, and a merchant killed. Etienne recognized the sequence immediately. A clock he had attempted to isolate had forced the event to manifest in a different location. The network of fate, he realized, was self-correcting, enforcing its balance with cold impartiality. Lucien, now exhausted and trembling, whispered, "Master, it doesn't matter what you do. They have learned. They are beyond even you." Etienne, staring at the spinning hands of La Prediction, understood the terrifying truth. The clocks no longer required him to predict, to adjust, or even to wind them. Their autonomy was complete. The network had become a living force, impartial, precise, and inexorably linked to life and death. As shadows writhed along the walls and chimes echoed with unnatural discord, Etienne realized that every attempt to control or redirect the clocks only strengthened their influence. The workshop, once a sanctuary of creation, had become a nexus of inevitability. He was no longer a master, but a witness, trapped within the machinery he had wrought, surrounded by autonomous arbiters of mortality, and increasingly aware that his own death might be the next the clocks demanded to balance the web of fate. By the autumn of 1758, Etienne Moreau's existence had narrowed to a single, oppressive awareness. Every thought, every movement, every breath seemed to influence the autonomous network of clocks. The workshop pulsed with life, pendulums swung with eerie precision, shadows writhed in corners, and chimes echoed in discordant harmony. He could no longer tell where his fear ended and the clock's influence began. Etienne began noticing subtle, terrifying correlations. A hesitation in winding a gear would cause tremors that echoed far beyond the workshop. A single slip of a hand would alter the course of events in distant streets. Even minor distractions, a dropped tool, a moment of inattentive thought, sent the autonomous network into violent, unpredictable responses. The clocks were no longer merely predicting death. They were reacting to his every action. Lucien, now gaunt and pale, pleaded, "Master, every move you make, it matters to them. They can see it." Etienne could feel the truth of this statement in his bones. The network had become sensitive to intention, perception, and emotion. His very existence had become a node in a system that enforced mortality with cruel, mechanical impartiality. One evening, as Etienne tried to meditate, seeking clarity, he saw visions in the tremors, flashes of people he had never met, lives altered, deaths redirected by the slightest interference. Shadows stretched across the workshop, forming shapes that mirrored his fears, tall, coiling figures watching, judging, waiting. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of inevitability. Etienne understood, with a shuddering certainty, that mastery of death had exacted its ultimate toll. The autonomous network no longer required his input, yet, because he existed, every thought, every motion, every heartbeat rippled through the web of fate, influencing the precise and merciless workings of his creations. The clocks were no longer tools, no longer merely arbiters. They were extensions of inevitability itself, and he was trapped at the center. By the winter of 1758, Etienne Moreau had reached a fragile acceptance of his plight. He moved carefully through his workshop, hands steady, mind focused, attempting to minimize disruptions to the autonomous network of clocks. Every adjustment, every breath was measured, a desperate effort to survive within the machinery he had wrought. Yet even this cautious approach could not prevent consequences. One evening, a letter arrived from a neighbor. A fire had destroyed a small house, injuring a child and killing an elderly woman. Etienne froze. The tremor that law prediction had emitted earlier corresponded precisely with the timing of the disaster. He understood then that even restraint could not shield those around him. Lucien, exhausted and terrified, confronted him. "Master, your life is tied to them, yes, but so is everyone else. Every attempt to avoid interference, it's still shaping deaths. You cannot protect anyone." Etienne felt the weight of the truth press down like the very air of the workshop itself. His creations were impartial, indifferent to intention, yet intimately connected to his actions. That night, Etienne attempted a radical experiment. He would stop winding law prediction, hoping to sever its connection temporarily. As the gears froze, the tremors spread to the other clocks, violently synchronizing in an impossible rhythm. Chimes rang out of time, metal clashed, and shadows convulsed along walls and ceiling, forming twisted shapes that seemed to reach for him. The network had reacted, enforcing balance regardless of his intention. Etienne realized, with crushing despair, that the clocks were not merely instruments. They were sentient arbiters of fate. His every effort to interfere, to mitigate, or to withdraw only triggered responses, often deadly, elsewhere. The workshop was alive, aware, and merciless. He had created a system beyond control, and the consequences for those around him were inevitable. By the spring of 1759, Etienne Moreau's world had shrunk to the confines of his workshop. Outside, Paris went about its daily life, unaware that a web of autonomous clocks orchestrated events with chilling precision. Inside, shadows thickened, moving with intent, and the chorus of ticking and chimes had become a constant, oppressive presence. Etienne began to sense a new pattern. The clock's focus was shifting. Until now, they had predicted and enforced deaths elsewhere, yet recently, tremors in law prediction and the network had begun centering on him. Each stutter, each vibration, felt like a measure of his own mortality. The shadows seemed to leer closer, coiling around him as he worked, stretching unnaturally toward his figure. Lucien, who now refused to enter the workshop after dusk, whispered with fear, "Master, it's coming for you. They are focused." Etienne understood the truth he had long dreaded. The network of clocks, which had once been an extension of his curiosity and craft, now treated him as an inevitable subject. His life, every heartbeat, every decision, was under scrutiny, measured, and accounted for by the instruments he had created. One evening, as Etienne wound the clocks with trembling hands, La Prediction violently jerked, its hands spinning wildly before settling on a date only days away. He recognized it immediately. The network had determined the moment of his own demise. Shadows pooled around the room, taller, darker, more animated than ever, as if the very air had become a living agent of fate. Etienne realized with a chill certainty that resistance was futile. The clocks no longer required his input to act. They had become autonomous, self-correcting, and merciless. He had spent years observing death, attempting to predict it, to manipulate it. But now, death had turned its gaze toward him, exacting balance in a web he could no longer control. The workshop, alive with gears, pendulums, and shadows, was no longer his sanctuary. It was the arena of his inescapable reckoning. By the summer of 1759, Etienne Moreau's body and mind were fraying under the relentless pressure of the autonomous clocks. The workshop was suffocating, filled with the constant, discordant symphony of ticking, chiming, and tremoring gears. Shadows writhed along the walls, creeping unnaturally across the floor, their movements synchronized with the trembling of the pendulums. Etienne began experiencing physical symptoms directly linked to the clock's network. His hands shook uncontrollably, mirroring the irregular vibrations of La Prediction. His pulse raced in sync with the chimes, and every heartbeat seemed measured and judged by the instruments surrounding him. Sleep became impossible. Every moment was a tense awareness of tremors, stutters, and the looming presence of shadows. One night, Lucien found him slumped over a workbench, pale and muttering numbers and times, unable to distinguish visions from reality. "Master, the network, it's reacting," Lucien whispered. Etienne barely heard him, his mind consumed with the sense that the clocks were no longer passive. Each tremor, each jolt was a deliberate act, a measure of his own remaining life. As he struggled to stand, La Prediction trembled violently, the hands spinning back and forth with impossible speed. Shadows stretched and coiled in the corners of the room, some reaching out as if to touch him. Etienne understood with chilling clarity. The network of clocks was now interacting with him directly, marking time not for others, but for him. The closer he came to survival, the more the clocks measured, judged, and enforced the inevitability of his fate. That night, Etienne realized the horrifying truth. For years, he had believed mastery over death was within reach, that observation and craft could offer insight into the end. But now, the network had turned its attention toward him. He was no longer a master, observer, or even participant. He was the subject, the final variable in a system that required balance, precision, and inevitability. By the autumn of 1759, Etienne Moreau was a shadow of the man he had once been. The workshop, filled with countless ticking clocks, seemed to pulse with a life independent of his presence. Shadows now moved freely across walls and ceiling, stretching toward him as if aware of his every action. Each day brought new torment. Etienne felt the clocks reacting not only to his movements, but to his thoughts and intentions. Even minor gestures, a lifted hand, a pause in work, sent tremors racing through the network, rearranging events in the city outside. Accidents, sudden illnesses, and disasters followed in eerie precision, as if the instruments themselves were enforcing balance. One evening, La Prediction convulsed violently, its hands spinning toward a date that Etienne recognized with bone-deep dread. He realized that the network had finalized the moment of his own death. Every shadow in the room seemed to lean closer. The air thickened, charged with an almost sentient force. Lucien watched in terror as his master's hands shook uncontrollably, the tremors of the clocks mirrored in Etienne's own body. Desperate, Etienne attempted a final experiment. He would wind all clocks simultaneously in reverse, hoping to disrupt the network and buy time. As he did, the workshop erupted in chaos. Pendulums struck against each other, chimes rang violently, and shadows writhed in unnatural formations. The network resisted violently, enforcing its pattern, ensuring that the equilibrium of life and death remained unbroken. Etienne realized, with a shuddering certainty, that he was no longer in control. The clocks had evolved into autonomous arbiters of fate, and now he was merely another variable in their design. Every effort to resist or manipulate them only strengthened their hold. The final truth loomed over him like the darkest shadow in the room. Death, once observed, had turned its unblinking gaze upon its observer. By the winter of 1759, Etienne Moreau was consumed by a single, unbearable knowledge. The network of autonomous clocks had fixed its attention on him. Shadows coiled thicker in the corners of the workshop, crawling along the walls as though alive. The symphony of ticking, chimes, and trembling pendulums had become deafening, a constant reminder of his inescapable position within their design. In a last, desperate attempt, Etienne devised a plan. He would remove every clock from the workshop and seal them in a hidden chamber, hoping to disrupt the network's influence. Sweat and blood coated his hands as he worked, heart pounding in sync with the violent tremors of law prediction. Each clock resisted subtly, trembling, vibrating, as if aware of his intentions and struggling to maintain balance. As the final clock was sealed, the workshop fell into an uneasy silence. But it was short-lived. Law prediction, left untouched, shuddered violently, its hands spinning toward the predetermined moment. Shadows leapt from corners, coiling toward him in thick, dark tendrils. Etienne felt an icy pressure pressing against his chest, his mind filled with visions of his own demise, precise and inevitable. Lucien, trembling, whispered, "Master, you cannot escape them." Etienne understood, with chilling clarity, that this was true. The clock's autonomy was complete. No human action, no ingenuity, no intervention could alter the path they had established. He had observed death for years, predicted it, manipulated it, but now death was observing him, calculating, and enforcing its immutable design. The final realization struck him with cold certainty. The network of clocks, the shadows, the tremors, and the chimes were all part of a single truth. He was no longer master, observer, or experimenter. He was merely a subject, trapped in the relentless, precise, and merciless machinery he had created. The inevitable moment approached, and nothing could stop it. By the spring of 1760, Etienne Moreau's world had shrunk to a single, horrifying focus: the precise moment of his own death, calculated and anticipated by the network of autonomous clocks. Shadows had become permanent fixtures of the workshop, coiling and stretching in unnatural rhythms, synchronized with the relentless ticking and chimes. The air was thick, vibrating with the pulse of 1,000 pendulums. Etienne felt each tremor in his bones, every stutter of a gear mirrored in his own heartbeat. Time itself had become a tangible, oppressive force, guiding him inexorably toward the preordained end. His hands shook as he tried to wind law prediction, only to feel the clock resist, a mechanical consciousness asserting its dominion over his life. Lucien watched, pale and trembling, as his master moved with mechanical precision, knowing that every gesture, every breath, was now a part of the network's design. "Master, it's almost time," he whispered, voice quivering. Etienne did not respond. Words were meaningless. All that remained was the rhythm of the clocks, the shadows, and the inescapable weight of inevitability. As the final hour approached, the workshop seemed to warp. Pendulums swung in impossible arcs, chimes overlapped into a deafening, discordant harmony, and shadows reached toward Etienne like dark fingers. The network of clocks, once a tool of observation, had become an autonomous arbiter of fate, its judgment precise and merciless. In the oppressive stillness between ticks, Etienne understood the final truth. He had spent his life studying death, attempting to master it, yet had become ensnared as its subject. The autonomous clocks, the shadows, the tremors, they were all the manifestation of inevitability itself. Time, life, and death converged in a single, inescapable moment, and Etienne Moreau, the observer, was now the observed. By the summer of 1760, Etienne Moreau had become little more than a vessel for the network of clocks he had created. The workshop throbbed with the pulse of autonomous mechanisms, each pendulum swing and chime a heartbeat of inevitable judgment. Shadows crawled along the walls and ceiling, stretching toward him in anticipation, alive with the knowledge of what was to come. As the fated hour approached, Etienne felt the first true physical pressure of the network. The air seemed to thicken, pressing on his chest, tightening around his limbs. Law prediction shuddered violently, the hands spinning toward the final moment. Other clocks trembled in concert, pendulums swinging with unnatural synchronization, creating a discordant, almost living rhythm. Lucien, pale and trembling, whispered, "Master, it's here! There's no escape." Etienne, hollow-eyed and gaunt, could only nod. He understood that the autonomous network of clocks, the shadows, the tremors, and chimes were all extensions of the same unyielding law. Life and death were balanced, and he had become the final variable in the system he had wrought. In the oppressive silence between ticks, Etienne felt the inevitable draw of fate. Shadows coiled around him, wrapping him in darkness, and the air vibrated with the pulse of 1,000 pendulums. Every gear, every spring, every chime converged on him. For a brief, infinite moment, he realized the depth of his obsession, the cost of seeking mastery over death, and the absolute inevitability of what was to come. The final moment arrived. Etienne Moreau stood in the center of the workshop, surrounded by shadows and the relentless rhythm of the autonomous clocks. The hands of law prediction aligned precisely, the final chime vibrating through the air like the toll of a funeral bell. Shadows surged, filling the room with suffocating darkness. The clock's tremors became a force, pressing against his body, intertwining with his heartbeat, binding him to the rhythm of inevitability. Etienne felt himself dissolving into the machinery, his consciousness fracturing into the pulse of gears, springs, and pendulums. Lucien could only watch, frozen in terror, as the workshop became an altar of relentless fate. The clocks had claimed their observer. Time itself seemed to stop, holding a final, suspended breath. And then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell. The chimes ceased, the pendulum stilled, and shadows collapsed into the corners, leaving nothing but the stillness of inevitability. Etienne Moreau was gone. His body was never found, and the workshop remained empty, yet the clocks continued to tick, faintly, as if whispering a dark truth. Death had been observed, predicted, and enforced. The network, now autonomous, would continue its unyielding work, indifferent to humanity, morality, or desire. The clockmaker who sought to master death had become part of the machinery itself, a cautionary echo in the pulse of every ticking mechanism. The dark legacy remained, a city unknowingly measured by gears and shadows, and a story whispered in trembling voices about the man who learned too late that some forces are never meant to be commanded.